First, I want to discuss what was going on inside Ghibli around this time. To do that, I made this chronological table of Ghibli. This is it. The real chronology should be more detailed, like when the comic version of Nausicaa started around here, or it got suspended, etc. But those are not included here. I just wrote down what was necessary for today. First, Future Boy Conan was aired in 1978, and Castle of Cagliostro was shown in theaters in December 1979. I think this was the first evaluation period of Miyazaki. Miyazaki made 26 episodes for NHK called Future Boy Conan, which is based on a novel titled The Incredible Tide. People quickly acknowledged his talent. Then he made Castle of Cagliostro, which was his first feature film. This was the first evaluation period. Well, he was still only known within the anime industry then. However, as you all know, this was a major, historical box office bomb, and Miyazaki was instantly deprived of making a movie. But after 5 years of silence, he released Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind in March 1984, and he also worked on its comic version during this time. Then finally Laputa was released in August 1986. There is a 2-year gap between those two pieces because the staff were disbanded after Nausicaa, and then reassembled for Laputa, which added extra unnecessary work. The reason I also listed Grave of the Fireflies, which was Takahata's work, here is because Laputa became the last work that Takahata produced. Or, you can say Miyazaki became independent from Takahata after Laputa. It means their ideological differences became clear, or Miyazaki finally graduated from the school of Takahata. And Miyazaki no longer needed to be produced by him after Laputa. You can tell that Takahata complained a lot about Laputa, while Miyazaki also said things about Takahata's The Grave of the Fireflies and Only Yesterday. He was like, gee, why would he do that? So it's clear Laputa was the turning point where their ideologies completely diverged from each other. Then, My Neighbor Totoro and The Grave of the Fireflies were released in 1988. Totoro is highly rated now, but Totoro and The Grave of the Fireflies did pretty poorly in theaters. So actually, Nausicaa was the only one that was a box office success compared to other pieces. But although I won't call Laputa a complete failure, it still didn't recoup its budget in theaters, which they had to make up through VHS sales later on. And as I said, Totoro and The Grave of the Fireflies were flops. Ghibli started making profits from Kiki's delivery service in 1989. So that's the major flow of events. And what did Ghibli do when they suddenly had money in their hands? They made Only Yesterday in 1991, which went into the red. On top of that, Miyazaki and Takahata could no longer work in the same room around this time. In 1992, when Miyazaki made Porco Rosso, even though they were both working for Ghibli, they started working in different studios. Consider this the major historical flow of Ghibli. Now, I talked about this in a rerun on the New Year's Day, so you may all know. When Miyazaki's Future Boy Conan was released, unfortunately, Farewell to Space Battleship Yamato came out. Miyazaki was like, Future Boy Conan is the true sci-fi. This is the anime. It was on the national channel NHK and all that. But because Yamato created a major animation boom, almost no one really appreciated Future Boy Conan, except for some anime buffs. Not only that, when Miyazaki made his first feature film, The Castle of Cagliostro, claiming, "I've put in everything that I wanted to express in this piece," the epic series Mobile Suit Gundam began airing on TV almost at the same time, and as a result, all anime magazines, except for Animeju, pretty much only cared about Gundam. We feel that Nausicaa was so popular back in the days just because it's been on reruns so many times, but in fact its box office record was not that different from the movie version of Super Dimension Fortress Macross that came out around the same time. Plus, Macross clearly sold more merchandise than Nausicaa, if we count the sales of related products. That's why the 70s to early 80s, from Future Boy Conan to Laputa, were a complete dark age for Miyazaki, despite the fact that he was allowed to produce films. So I categorize him as a creator who could not keep up with the so-called first anime boom that started with Space Battleship Yamato and ended with Super Dimension Fortress Macross. But of course, that also means no one at that time really understood how great Miyazaki was. Now, Miyazaki refers to Castle of Cagliostro, Nausicaa, Laputa, and Totoro as a rectangle. Well, Miyazaki himself talks about this episode in an interview in this stylish magazine called Cut, and he talked a lot there. So most of what Miyazaki said, which I'll quote, are from this interview. And I'll quote other people from the books I've aligned here. For example, I'll quote from this book called Ghibli's textbook, Laputa, Castle in the Sky. I also thought this book was pretty cool. It's called Another Balse, written by a production assistant of Laputa called Mr. Kihara, and it's got some good stories, so I'll sample them as well. So, for today's broadcast, these published texts will be the basis of what I will discuss in the lecture. Now, as I said earlier, Miyazaki calls Cagliostro, Nausicaa, Laputa, Totoro a rectangle. So what that means is that he did everything he wanted to do. He tried different approaches for each of those 4 works, so there was nothing left to do when he was done. So he said, after I finished the 4 works, I no longer intended to direct anime. I was fed up with it, and I wanted to go back to the position of animator. He said this many times here and there, but accordingly, when he completed Nausicaa, he requested, "Let me become an animator again ASAP." But pretty much no one who moved up from animator to director then went back down. For example, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko, the character designer of Gundam, started out as an animator, then became a character designer, then a director. That's the career path for almost all animators. Some directors sometimes help others out with drawings, but that's it. But when Nausicaa was completed, people told Miyazaki, "So isn't Nausicaa 2 coming up next?" Despite their expectations, Miyazaki went to Suzuki and yelled. He was emotional rather than mad. He pleaded, "I can't stand losing more friends." Because when an animator becomes a director, they gradually get left out by their peer animators, because the director's job is to say, "This is good" or "This is bad" to their drawings. Miyazaki thought that's the role of an administrator, whom we, the animators, all used to hate when we belonged to Toei Animation. It's not what we should do to each other. He knew his fellow animators understood his position because they were a team, but he also understood how animators always found directors a bit annoying. That's why Miyazaki said, "I've lost all of my friends through making Nausicaa. That's why I don't want to be a director ever again. Do you understand how I feel, Suzuki-san?" Previously, Miyazaki also cried to Takahata, "Takahata-san, please let me help you with your current project as an animator." Takahata was surprised and replied, "What? You finally became a director and now you want to become an animator again?" But then he thought, "Oh wait, if Miyazaki comes back to my team, that'll be awesome." So he gave him tons of drawing work for Anne of Green Gables, which he was working on back then, and said, "Okay, here you go." Miyazaki was like, "Gee, now I'm an animator again. I can't be happier. I'm never gonna direct again." Then he began drawing at a furious speed. And before the day was over, he started picking on the drawings of his colleague who was sitting next to him and went, "That's wrong, give that to me," and started redoing them like crazy. So he left Anne of Green Gables just like that and started directing the Castle of Cagliostro. It sounds like a joke, like a comedy skit by Tokyo 03. That's the kind of man Hayao Miyazaki is. He's got such big mood swings. So, if he thinks he can do something, he tries to do it all. But if he doesn't, then he goes, "I'm so useless," and he doesn't just think like that, but also acts upon it. A person like that is described as an instantaneous water heater in Japan. Someone who loses temper quickly and cools down just as fast. But in the case of Miyazaki, he doesn't just lose his temper, but instantly explodes like a nuclear reaction. Anyway, back to the main topic. He said these 4 works were something he'd always wanted to make, but now, having completed them, he no longer had anything he wanted to do. At least, that's what he was thinking around this time. So he was actually going to let someone else make Kiki's Delivery Service. That's how accomplished he felt after completing Laputa. And I think that was his honest opinion, except for Kiki's Delivery Service, which from halfway he had to take over in directing. It was only 4 years after he completed Totoro that he finally decided to make another film, Porco Rosso. For 4 years, he had nothing that he really wanted to express. So, I think he was pretty serious about saying, I'm done. I've completed the 4 corners of the rectangle.